Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. He was just an old man working the morning shift at a local store. Slow, quiet, barely noticed. But when the manager fired him for not keeping up, what followed was something no one could have expected. A simple envelope left on a desk would unravel a past full of heartbreak, sacrifice, and secrets that could silence a room. What happens when you judge someone without knowing the story they carry? This isn't just a story about losing a job. It's about losing sight of what matters most. Stick around, because the truth behind why he was slow will leave you speechless. The morning light sliced through the smudged glass doors of Parkridge Supermart as the first employee clocked in, rubbing sleep from his eyes while tying his apron with a grunt of routine. Jason Miller stood by the front counter, clean-shaven and sharp-eyed, the brand-new manager of the aging grocery store that still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and yesterday's deli cuts. He was only 33, fresh off a promotion from corporate, still sipping from his confidence like it was piping hot espresso. Jason had ideas, a plan to make everything faster, leaner, and smarter, because he believed efficiency was the god of modern business. He watched his staff closely that first week, noting with silent frustration how some older employees moved as though time owed them favors. One in particular, Mr. Harold Granger, shuffled from aisle to aisle like a slow-moving shadow, his trembling hands carefully aligning cans with a concentration that irritated Jason. To Jason, it wasn't just slow, it was unacceptable. And the old man's pace clashed violently with the bright, fast world. Jason was determined to build. He saw Harold not as a loyal, long-term worker, but as dead weight dragging the future down by the ankles. Every morning, Harold arrived 10 minutes early, never late, his old brown coat buttoned up even in the spring, his thermos tucked beneath his arm like a loyal pet. He would nod politely to everyone, including Jason, before heading to the back room to change into his faded blue apron that bore the ghost of the store's old logo. No one ever saw him raise his voice, and no one really knew where he came from or why he still worked when most his age were long retired. He worked slowly, yes, but with a care that made customers pause and smile, even if the young shoppers sometimes huffed impatiently while waiting. Jason found this maddening because in his world, smiles didn't pay bills and patience didn't drive numbers on the quarterly report. He felt a responsibility to make changes, to shake the store from its sleep and usher in a new era, even if that meant stepping on old toes. But what Jason didn't realize was that Harold's hands weren't just slow. They were tired from decades of lifting more than just boxes and cans, and his silence wasn't emptiness. It was full of stories that no one had ever asked to hear. Jason began holding impromptu meetings, challenging staff to meet new speed goals and product placement metrics, using words like optimization and modernization, like weapons disguised as hope. Harold listened quietly during these meetings, nodding gently, writing notes in a small notebook he kept in his front pocket that looked older than the store itself. He never argued, never made excuses, and never changed his pace. And this made Jason see the more than outright defiance ever could. It's like he's stuck in slow motion, Jason muttered to the assistant manager one day watching Harold gently stack cereal boxes with the tenderness of placing headstones. To Jason, the old man's refusal to adapt wasn't noble. It was stubbornness wrapped in nostalgia, and it was time for sentimentality to step aside. He began documenting performance issues, noting times Harold took too long to restock, or spent more minutes than usual helping elderly customers with their carts. The younger staff, watching Jason's energy and ambition, began following suit, no longer greeting Harold with warmth, but instead with side glances that screamed impatience and quiet judgment. Then came the day that set it all in motion. The delivery truck arrived an hour late, and chaos erupted as the crew scrambled to unload and restock. Jason darted between aisles barking orders, sleeves rolled up, trying to meet a tight deadline before the district rip arrived for a surprise inspection. Amid the commotion, he saw Harold bent over a broken crate of soup cans, slowly gathering them into a box, as if each one were made of glass. "We don't have time for this, Harold," Jason snapped, the frustration finally boiling over into words heavy with disappointment. Harold looked up, startled, his eyes watery but his voice calm, saying only, "I'm doing the best I can, sir." That response, so simple and so old-fashioned, rang in Jason's ears like an insult, like the man had admitted to failure without even trying to apologize or change. Later that afternoon, after the inspection passed by a razor-thin margin, Jason called Harold into the back office, a small grey room with a flickering light and the smell of printer toner. Harold sat down carefully, setting his thermos beside the chair, his eyes patient, as if he already knew what was coming. Jason began reading from the prepared sheet in front of him, citing slow performance, safety risks, and failure to meet updated expectations as reasons for termination. Harold said nothing at first, simply nodding along as if Jason were reading the weather report and not dismantling the remainder of his working life. "I'm sorry, Mr. Granger, but we need to move forward," Jason said. Not unkindly, but firmly, like a man trying to justify pushing a boulder down a hill. The old man stood, reached for his thermos, and offered his hand with a quiet dignity that felt heavier than 1,000 arguments. "Thank you for the time I had," he said, and left the room with a grace that made Jason feel more uncomfortable than he'd expected. The rest of the staff didn't say much when they heard. Some nodded, others just shrugged, because in a place where change was currency, sentiment had no place on the shelves. Jason felt a strange emptiness that evening as he walked through the now silent store, his shoes echoing against the freshly mopped floors. He told himself it was the right call, that sometimes growth demanded sacrifice, even if that sacrifice wore worn-out shoes and carried soup cans like relics. But when he passed aisle 6 and saw the perfectly stacked pyramid of green beans Harold had left behind, something inside him hesitated. There was something in the way each label faced outward, aligned like a soldier's salute, that felt like more than just work. It felt like a goodbye letter from a man too proud to speak in tears. Jason shook it off, convincing himself the feeling would pass, that the world had no use for slow steps in fast-moving storms. He didn't know yet that a story was unfolding beneath his own ambition, one that would humble him, haunt him, and ultimately change everything. The next morning, Jason arrived at the store earlier than usual, the spring rain making soft music against the rooftop. As he unlocked the doors with tired fingers, he moved through the aisles mechanically, checking for anything out of place, though his eyes kept drifting toward the back room where Harold had always clocked in. Something about the silence in the store felt different, not peaceful but empty, like the soul of the place had been carefully packed away and carried out in an old man's coat. When he stepped into the office to review the morning checklist, he noticed something unusual on the desk beside the phone. Harold's thermos, still upright, still warm to the touch. Jason frowned, confused by its presence, and picked it up gently, wondering how the man could have forgotten the one thing he carried every single day without fail. The thermos was heavy in his hand, a dull steel cylinder scratched and dented from years of use, as worn and reliable as the man who once carried it. He sat down slowly, fingers tracing the initials carved near the bottom, with the kind of care you only give to things that begin to whisper back. Curiosity overcame Jason's hesitation, and he unscrewed the lid, expecting the usual bitter scent of black coffee, but instead inhaling something faintly floral and strangely familiar. It smelled like a memory, the kind that tugs at your ribs without your permission, the way a forgotten song can make your eyes sting for reasons you can't name. Inside the thermos was a folded piece of paper, tucked inside a plastic sandwich bag, as if it were a letter buried for safekeeping in a storm. Jason unwrapped it carefully, smoothing the creases on his desk, and began to read, unsure of why his heart was already beating faster. The handwriting was small, neat, and trembling, each letter written as if it had taken great effort, like a man carving truth into the walls of time. The note wasn't addressed to anyone by name, but it told a story, one sentence at a time, about a man who had once lost everything and found his only peace in the quiet rhythm of honest work. Jason's breath caught as he realized what he was reading wasn't just a goodbye. It was a confession soaked in sorrow and silence. The note spoke of a daughter who had died young from a rare illness, and a wife who had never recovered from the loss, eventually slipping into dementia and needing full-time care. It told of nights spent working janitorial shifts at schools and supermarkets just to afford medicine and home care aids, while pretending to the world that retirement was a choice and not a surrender. It described Harold's love for routine, how stocking shelves gave him a sense of control when the rest of life spun too fast to hold on to, and most painfully, it spoke of how he used to whisper his daughter's name when he stacked soup cans, because it reminded him of when she used to help him unpack groceries on Sunday afternoons. Jason read it all, hands trembling slightly, as the office lights flickered overhead like a broken metronome marking a truth long ignored. He didn't realize he was crying until one of his tears landed on the page, smudging a line that read, "I don't have much left to give, but I give it all anyway." Jason sat there for a long time, the thermos still warm beside him like a hand on his shoulder, the letter pressing against his heart like a silent rebuke. The store began to wake around him, voices coming in, lights flickering on, doors opening, but he couldn't move from the chair, couldn't unhear what he had just read. He had made a decision with his eyes closed to humanity and opened only to performance metrics, and now the weight of it pressed on his chest like regret made of bricks. He thought of Harold walking out of the office the day before, his spine straight, despite the ache he must have carried, and realized the strength it took to leave with dignity after a life full of invisible battles. Jason had fired him for being slow, but now he saw that slowness not as weakness, but as the careful movement of someone carrying fragile pieces of a life too broken to explain. For the first time in his career, Jason felt shame, not just for a poor decision, but for failing to see the soul behind the uniform. He stood abruptly, the office suddenly too small for the storm inside his chest, and walked out into the store with a look that startled the employees already clocked in. Without explaining, he asked the assistant manager to cover for him and left the store, the thermos still in his hand, the letter tucked into his jacket like a wound. He drove with no destination, his fingers gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the present. Jason didn't know where Harold lived, but he remembered something from the employment file, a home address in the quieter part of town, near the old bridge where the river curved like a sleeping serpent. He drove there, heart pounding, unsure of what he would say, unsure if Harold would even open the door after what had been done. All he knew was that the silence inside him had turned into a roar of guilt and longing, and he needed to see the man he had dismissed like a faulty cog in a machine. When he arrived, he found a modest house with cracked white paint and an overgrown garden blooming wildly with yellow tulips and creeping vines. Jason stepped out of the car, rain falling gently around him like a benediction, and approached the front porch with hesitant steps and a heartbeat that pounded like judgment. The front door opened before he could knock, and there stood Harold, not surprised, not angry, just tired, as if he'd been expecting this moment like a chapter long overdue. Jason opened his mouth, but the words tangled in his throat, so he simply held out the thermos with both hands, like a child returning something precious he'd broken. Harold looked at it, then at Jason, and finally nodded once, taking it back, as if receiving more than just an object, but a gesture of repentance. Jason whispered, "I read your letter," and the old man looked away, not in shame, but in silent remembrance of things that had no words left to give. They stood there on the porch, as the rain continued to fall, neither speaking, the silence between them deep but not empty, more like the space between two notes in a symphony. Eventually, Harold stepped aside and opened the door wider, a quiet invitation that said everything words couldn't. Jason entered, not as a manager, not as a corporate man, but as a humbled human being walking into a lesson he had never studied. He didn't know then how this visit would change, not only the trajectory of his career, but the depth of his heart. But he knew this. He had fired the old man for being slow, and now he was the one learning the value of slowing down. And as the door closed behind them, the sound wasn't one of finality, but the beginning of a story neither of them had expected to finish together. The living room was quiet, filled with old photographs, shelves heavy with worn books, and the faint scent of lavender and time-worn dust that made the air feel like a memory. Jason sat stiffly on a floral-patterned couch, while Harold moved slowly toward the kitchen, the thermos cradled in his hands like a relic of something sacred and deeply personal. The ticking of a wall clock marked each second with the same patience Harold used to face each task in the store, and Jason wondered how he had ever mistaken such steadiness for incompetence. On a small table near the window sat a frame with a black and white photo of a young girl beaming beside a man who looked like Harold in a different life, taller, stronger, and lighter with hope. The girl's smile reached her eyes in a way that said she hadn't yet known pain, and Jason's chest tightened as he imagined the weight of her absence hanging in every corner of this home. The house didn't feel abandoned, but it did feel like it had been grieving for a long time. Every cushion, curtain, and crack in the wall whispering stories too fragile to say out loud. Harold returned with 2 cups of coffee on a small tray, the steam rising like ghosts between them as he set it down and took the armchair across from Jason. There was no bitterness in his expression, no pride or performative forgiveness, only the calm endurance of a man who had weathered too many storms to waste time on anger. Jason took the coffee with trembling hands, unsure how to meet Harold's gaze, feeling more like a student than a store manager in the presence of someone who had mastered lessons life never teaches in boardrooms. "She used to make the coffee," Harold said softly, eyes flickering to the photo on the table, his voice carrying the weight of memories held too tightly for too long. Jason nodded, unsure if he should speak. afraid that whatever he said would come out clumsy and hollow compared to the quiet poetry of Harold's sorrow. "She was everything good I ever did," Harold continued, the words unraveling slowly, like old stitches finally giving way to truth. As Harold spoke, he told Jason about his daughter Anna, how she loved painting butterflies on the walls of her room and singing with her mouth full at the dinner table. He shared how the sickness had come suddenly. One week it was just a cough, and the next it was a terminal diagnosis that shattered their reality into pieces too sharp to touch. Harold explained how he had worked 3 jobs during her treatment, never once missing a day, because every dollar mattered. Every shift was another dose, another scan, another sliver of hope. Jason listened, eyes burning, the coffee in his cup untouched and growing cold, as Harold described how after Anna passed, his wife never really came back from the grief. He told of how he'd sit beside her bed every evening, brushing her hair while she asked questions she had already asked 10 times that day, each one breaking his heart again, like it was new. "I got used to being needed, even if no one noticed," Harold said, voice like gravel, as he looked down at his hands that had grown calloused from a lifetime of holding too much. Jason felt a guilt so heavy it wrapped itself around his shoulders like a winter coat, soaked in shame, and still he said nothing, letting Harold's story be what it needed to be, uninterrupted, unjudged, unburdened by apologies too late to undo the pain. The room was filled with silence again, but this time it was the kind that allowed breath, like the hush before dawn, when even the world itself exhales. Jason finally spoke, softly, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know," and Harold nodded, not with forgiveness, but understanding that sometimes ignorance is a wound, not a weapon. "I didn't want you to," Harold replied, setting his cup down and clasping his hands together, eyes on the window where rain was tracing lines like veins across the glass. "This job, it wasn't about money for me anymore," he continued, voice cracking slightly. "It was about keeping my hands busy so my heart wouldn't fall apart." Jason's throat tightened as he thought of the clipboard, the metrics, the demerits for slow shelf restocking, that now felt cruel in their precision. Jason leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said, "I thought I was helping the store, being efficient, following policy. But I was wrong. I wasn't seeing you. I was only seeing numbers." The confession came out raw and awkward. But Harold didn't flinch, only nodded again, the same way he had so many times while listening to customers complain or being overlooked during staff meetings. "You're young," Harold said. "You've got ambition, and ambition blinds. But one day, if you're lucky, it'll open your eyes too." The words struck Jason like a quiet thunder, shaking something loose inside him that he hadn't known was clenched, something like pride, or maybe fear of admitting that he'd failed. The coffee had gone cold, but neither of them moved to refill it, both men sitting in the stillness of the room, as if warming themselves in the heat of hard truths shared. Jason looked up, and in Harold's eyes he didn't see judgment, only a patient sorrow that had long since learned how to forgive the world for its cruelty. In that moment, Jason made a decision, not just to fix what he could, but to change the way he looked at the people behind the uniforms, the hands behind the barcodes, the stories behind the slowness. "Come back," he said suddenly, the words rushing out before he had time to second-guess them. "Please come back, not just to work, but because we need you." Harold raised an eyebrow, but not with suspicion, with surprise, like a man who'd stopped expecting such things. He asked quietly, though the weight of the question wasn't really about employment. Jason's voice wavered, but held steady. Because you remind us that people matter more than the pace they move. You remind me. There was a pause that followed, deep and soft, like the silence after someone says your name with love for the first time in years. Harold looked out the window again, then back at Jason, and something behind his tired eyes shifted, like a door creaking open after decades of being locked. "I'll think about it," Harold said at last, and Jason nodded, more grateful for those 4 words than he had been for any approval or praise in his career. They sat in silence for a while longer, until the rain outside began to ease and the clock ticked gently into a new hour, like a promise being made in quiet. Jason stood to leave, placing the empty coffee cup back on the tray, and turned to Harold with a hand outstretched, firm, honest, and steady. Harold stood too, slower than before, but with a kind of grace that came from having lived through storms and still choosing to open the door to others. Their hands met in a firm shake, not as employee and employer, but as 2 men meeting halfway across a bridge, built from understanding and humility. As Jason stepped out into the soft grey afternoon, he didn't feel like he'd fixed anything, but he felt like he'd started something better than repair, redemption. And somewhere behind him, Harold closed the door gently, the way you do when you know the world might still hold some kindness after all. The store felt colder when Jason walked in the next morning, not from the air conditioning, but from the quiet looks exchanged by the staff, who had heard rumors about Harold's firing. The break room, usually filled with the clatter of mugs and scattered laughter, was silent as Jason passed, and he could feel eyes on his back, like questions never voiced aloud. Tanya, the assistant manager, glanced up from her clipboard with a frown that was more concerned than critical, the kind of look you give someone when you're not sure how far they've fallen. Jason gave her a nod, weak and uncertain, then stepped into his office, where Harold's name was still listed under recently terminated on the HR printout. He stared at that paper for a long time, the black letters etched like regret on white, sterile finality, and before he even took off his coat, he crumpled the sheet and threw it in the bin. As he sat at his desk, Jason realized how empty the room felt without Harold's quiet presence in the aisles, the subtle way he greeted each morning with a calm, "Good day, son," as if every dawn was a second chance. Jason opened his laptop and hovered over the employee portal, his fingers pausing over the rehire option, battling between pride and the desire to do what was right. The system made it all so clinical: checkboxes, drop-down menus, confirmation buttons, but nothing about this felt simple or procedural. Just then Tanya knocked on the open door, her expression careful but inquisitive, and Jason gestured her in, suddenly aware of how much he needed someone to speak with. "We all saw the way you let Harold go," she began, voice low and not accusatory, but edged with disappointment. "It wasn't right, and you know it." Jason nodded, hands clasped in front of him like a boy waiting for detention, and said softly, "I know, that's why I visited him last night, to apologize." That caught Tanya off guard, her eyebrows rising slightly, and for the first time in days, Jason saw something other than criticism in her eyes, something like hope. "I didn't know his story," Jason continued, voice catching as the images of Harold's home and his daughter's photo flashed in his mind. "I judged the man by his speed, not his spirit." Tanya sank into the chair across from him and said, "We all noticed how he cared for the customers. He remembered their names, their favorite candy bars, their grandkids. That wasn't slowness, it was presence." Jason leaned back, sighing heavily, realizing how blind he had been to what truly made the store feel alive. Outside the office window, the store buzzed with movement, but it all felt mechanical without Harold's grounding calm. like a machine missing the cog that quietly made everything run smooth. Jason turned to Tanya and asked, "If I bring him back, will the team resent me? Will they think I'm only doing it because I feel guilty?" Tanya shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips for the first time that day, and replied, "They'll respect you more for it. We all make mistakes. Owning them, that's the hard part most people avoid." The truth of her words hit like a hammer, wrapped in kindness, and Jason stood, feeling a rare kind of resolve settle into his chest. "Then I'm not just rehiring him," he said. "I'm making space for his story, for everyone's stories." That afternoon, Jason gathered the entire staff in the break room, where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the vending machine hummed like white noise for awkward tension. He stood in front of the bulletin board, papers rustling behind him, and looked out at a room filled with folded arms, raised brows, and quiet discontent waiting for answers. "I owe all of you an apology," he began, voice firm but not loud, "especially for the way I treated Harold." A few gasps rippled through the group, but mostly there was stillness, the kind that listens because it doesn't expect honesty but hopes for it anyway. Jason continued, telling them about Harold's story. Not everything, just enough to shed light without breaking confidence. And he ended with the words, "He's coming back, and I hope we'll all welcome him the way he deserved from the start." No one clapped. There was no dramatic moment of instant forgiveness or applause, only a soft murmur as people exchanged glances and slowly nodded. The kind of shift that happens like thaw after a long winter. Tanya stepped forward first, her voice steady and kind, saying, "Thank you, Jason. That took guts." And a few others murmured their agreement, like seeds beginning to sprout in spring soil. Jason exhaled for the first time in what felt like days and smiled, a small, tired smile but real, and dismissed the meeting with a quiet, "Thank you for listening." As the staff filtered out, several employees patted his shoulder or offered half smiles, not full trust yet, but something like the beginning of grace. Alone again, Jason stared at the break room table where Harold used to sip his tea during lunch, his thermos resting beside his crossword puzzle, steady hands scribbling answers in pencil. Later that evening, Jason drove back to Harold's house with a rehire letter and a bag of groceries, apples, cereal, soup, and a small bouquet of yellow tulips that felt embarrassingly inadequate but deeply necessary. When Harold opened the door, Jason didn't speak right away. He just held out the bag with both hands like an offering of peace. "They want you back," Jason said finally. "I want you back, but only if you want it too." Harold looked at the bag, then at Jason, and then beyond him at the quiet street where a few porch lights flickered to life, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly, Harold took the bag, stepped aside, and said, "Come in, son. Let's talk about tomorrow." And Jason did, stepping back into a house of quiet memory, now filled with the fragile beginning of something new, understanding, humility, and the second chances that only come when we're brave enough to listen. The morning Harold returned to the store was strangely bright, as if the sun itself had been waiting for something to feel right again, in a place that had forgotten what steady warmth felt like. He wore the same pressed uniform and the same cap he always did, his name tag polished and sitting just right on his chest, but something in the way he walked, gentle, assured and quietly proud, made the usual bustle of the store pause in acknowledgement. Jason stood near the front with Tanya at his side, watching as Harold stepped through the doors and gave the same small smile he'd given every customer for the past 2 years, as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. Employees who had once whispered about his slowness now nodded respectfully, a few even walking over to shake his hand or pat his shoulder, their silent greetings speaking louder than apologies ever could. Harold looked each person in the eye, nodding once, not bitter or smug, but with a grace that seemed to humble everyone it touched, especially Jason. Jason cleared his throat and approached, trying not to seem overly formal or overly emotional, though he felt both tugging hard behind his eyes as he extended a hand. "Welcome back, Harold," Jason said, and Harold took his hand, shook it firmly, and said, "Good to be back, son," with the same calm voice that had once faded into the background, but now held the weight of something solid and earned. Tanya led Harold to the back room to store his belongings, but before he followed her, Harold turned to Jason and said, "You've changed, and I'm glad. You're paying attention now." Jason stood there a moment longer, hands in his pockets, feeling those words echo inside him like the aftershock of a long-needed truth. All day, he watched from the corner of his office window as Harold moved from aisle to aisle, interacting with customers in that slow, thoughtful rhythm that had once seemed like inefficiency, but now looked like intention. A little boy clung to his mother's leg near the cereal aisle, crying for a toy he couldn't have, and Harold knelt down, pulled a smiley face sticker from his pocket, and handed it to the child with a wink that quieted the tears. An elderly woman wandered near the canned goods, confused and flustered, and Harold offered his arm, guiding her gently with a whisper and a kindness that made her eyes tear up with gratitude. Jason noticed all of it, not just the actions but the reactions, the tiny ripples of peace. Harold left in his wake the sort of soft magic that couldn't be taught or measured on a performance review. As the hours passed, customers began asking for Harold by name, their voices lifting just slightly, as if he were not an employee, but an old friend returning from a long trip. Jason leaned back in his chair and thought, this is what leadership should have seen in the first place. This is what I failed to see. During the afternoon staff meeting, Jason surprised everyone by asking Harold to join, and, even more surprisingly, by handing him the floor. Harold looked at the group with the same quiet gaze that had watched over customers for years, and he said, "You don't always know what someone's carrying, but you can always choose how you carry them." The room was silent, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been too loud about the wrong things and too quiet about the things that matter. Harold continued, "Kindness isn't about speed, it's about seeing. Slowness isn't laziness. Sometimes it's just someone trying to hold together more than you can see." Jason swallowed hard and noticed Tanya dabbing her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. And when Harold finished, everyone clapped. Not because they were told to, but because it was the only thing their hearts knew to do in that moment. After the meeting, Jason pulled Harold aside and asked him something he hadn't asked anyone before. "Will you help me train the new hires?" Harold blinked in surprise, and Jason quickly added, "You see people, you teach without making them feel small. I want that in this store." Harold gave a slow nod and said, "I'll do my best, but I don't teach with manuals. I teach with moments." Jason smiled and said, "That's exactly why I'm asking." Over the next few weeks, Harold began guiding the new team members, not with rigid routines, but through conversations, shared lunches, small examples, and quiet observations that stuck longer than any slideshow could. Jason watched it unfold with awe, realizing that sometimes the most powerful shifts in culture come not from top-down policies, but from bottom-up wisdom passed hand to hand. One afternoon, Harold brought a photograph of his daughter to the staff lounge and pinned it on the community board, not to garner sympathy, but to remind everyone of why he showed up every day. of what his slow steps carried. The photo showed a young girl in a hospital bed, smiling wide, with Harold beside her holding a book open and her tiny hand resting on his. Beneath the photo, he wrote, "We all carry something. Be gentle." No one touched the photo, but everyone read the caption at least once. And from that day on, the break room felt different, quieter, more considerate, like even the walls knew to whisper. Jason started arriving earlier, not to catch mistakes, but to greet each staff member by name and ask about their day, about their lives, realizing now how little he'd really known them before. And every time he did, Harold would catch his eye across the room and give a small approving nod. One evening, long after closing, Jason and Harold stood outside the store, watching the parking lot empty as the sun dipped low on the horizon, coloring the world in hues too soft to rush through. Jason turned to Harold and said, "Thank you for coming back, for teaching me how to slow down and see." Harold looked at the fading light and replied, "Sometimes you have to lose sight to learn how to look again." They stood in silence, two men from different generations bound by a moment of mutual respect that didn't need to be spoken aloud. As the last car pulled out, Harold chuckled softly and said, "You know, son, it's never about how fast you walk, it's about who walks beside you." And for the first time in a long while, Jason felt like he was finally walking at the right pace. 2 weeks after Harold returned, the store was running smoother than it had in months, with the staff finally working not just efficiently, but kindly, like the air had shifted into something lighter and more respectful. Jason had begun to find joy in simple things again. The early morning bustle, the soft chatter of the employees, and even the mundane shuffle of receipts and schedules on his desk, all of which felt different now that his eyes had opened to the people behind the process. One Saturday morning, as customers flooded in with their weekend energy, a young woman stormed into the store, her heels clicking sharply and her eyes full of fire, heading straight for the customer service desk. Tanya was there and tried to greet her with a smile, but the woman interrupted her sharply, saying she had a complaint, one that needed the manager immediately. Jason stepped out of his office and approached calmly, prepared for anything, from a price mismatch to a faulty product. But what he didn't expect was to hear Harold's name fall sharply from the woman's lips. "That old man in aisle 4 just wasted 15 minutes of my time talking," she snapped, crossing her arms. "All I asked was where to find the gluten-free pasta." And he went on and on about his daughter, about love and time and slowing down. "I don't come here to be lectured by someone who can't do his job." Her words fell hard, slicing through the atmosphere like broken glass, and Jason felt his jaw tighten before he caught himself. Tanya looked to Jason, unsure, her eyes wide with the tension of someone standing at the edge of something delicate, something that could shatter further if handled wrong. Jason nodded respectfully, motioned for the woman to follow him into the office so they wouldn't draw a crowd, and once inside, he offered her a seat and listened fully, resisting the urge to defend Harold too quickly. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I understand your frustration, and I'm sorry if you felt your time wasn't respected. But I also know Harold, and he never means harm. Sometimes he simply sees more than what's on the surface." The woman scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Well, it's not his place to see anything. He's an employee. He's supposed to answer questions, not share sob stories." Jason sat with those words for a beat, feeling the heat rise in his chest, the same heat he'd once felt toward Harold, now twisted into something like protective fire. He glanced at a photo on his desk, an old teen picture, and remembered the quiet way Harold had guided a grieving father just the day before. "Do you have a daughter?" Jason asked suddenly, catching the woman off guard. She blinked, then frowned. "Yes. What does that have to do with anything?" Jason leaned forward gently, his voice even but firm. "Harold's daughter passed away. He used to tell her bedtime stories about pasta and kindness and patience because it calmed her down when the treatments got too hard. When you asked about gluten-free pasta, you triggered a memory, and he shared, not because he was slow, not because he was unprofessional, but because in his mind he was helping someone else's daughter in a way he never got to again." The woman went still, her mouth open slightly, her eyes flickering with something not quite regret, but discomfort reshaping itself into understanding. Jason continued, "We all move through the world expecting efficiency, but sometimes what we need more is humanity, especially in places like this, where we forget people aren't just uniforms and name tags." The woman looked away, blinking quickly, her posture softening as the sharpness drained from her expression, like a kettle slowly cooling. "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one ever does," Jason replied, "until they listen." There was a long pause, and then the woman nodded, slowly rising from her seat. "Thank you for telling me. I'll be more careful with my words next time." Jason nodded and walked her back to the entrance, where she paused, glanced toward aisle 4, and whispered, "Tell him I'm sorry." After she left, Jason walked toward the break room where Harold was sipping tea and reading a tattered paperback novel, his glasses perched at the tip of his nose. "You all right?" Jason asked, sitting across from him. Harold smiled faintly and said, "She had fire in her voice. That one, but I saw it. The fear behind her anger. That's what it usually is. Fear, not rudeness." Jason leaned back and laughed softly. "You're something else, Harold. You see storms and somehow always bring the calm." Harold chuckled. "I've weathered worse. And storms don't scare you when you've already lost what matters most." The room fell silent for a few seconds, filled with the soft hum of a distant radio and the echo of a truth too big to interrupt. That night, Jason stood at the front of the store as the last customer left, watching Harold sweep the floor with slow, even strokes, the same strokes Jason once deemed inefficient, but now recognized as sacred. The store was changing, not in layout or sales, but in spirit, reshaped by the hands of a man who never raised his voice, never demanded recognition, and yet taught more than any leadership seminar ever could. Jason closed his eyes for a moment and whispered a silent promise to himself to be the kind of manager who sees first, who listens deeper, and who never mistakes slowness for lack of value again. And as Harold locked the front doors with practiced fingers, the two men exchanged a glance that said more than words ever could. "We've both learned, and we're both still learning." Jason couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning beneath the sterile white sheets of his apartment, his mind replaying Harold's words like an old cassette stuck on repeat and unraveling at the seams of understanding. He rose before dawn, wrapped himself in a hoodie, and drove to the 24-hour diner down the street, the same one he used to visit with his dad before he passed away, back when mornings had a certain calm, like the world hadn't started rushing yet. As he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, Jason thought about how long it had taken him to see Harold as more than a line on the payroll, how blind ambition and obsession with productivity had kept him from noticing the human heart quietly beating beneath that dusty apron. The waitress smiled and placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him, but Jason barely noticed, his fingers tapping the rim of the mug, as if trying to drum out the guilt he couldn't name out loud. Images began to rise from the past, His father's tired hands after working late shifts, his mother's soft humming while folding laundry, and the day he got promoted and didn't stop to call them because he was too busy celebrating success with people who barely remembered his name the next day. Jason realized that somewhere along the way, he'd measured worth by speed, performance and profit, forgetting that his own roots were planted in sacrifice, slow nights, and unspoken love. He thought of Harold again, how the man always took time to check if someone had eaten, how he kept a stash of tissues near the register for teary customers, and how he once stopped a toddler from running into the parking lot without asking for praise. It hit Jason like a wave crashing over fragile rocks. Harold was the kind of man his father used to be, and he had almost discarded him like expired inventory. As Jason finished his coffee, the sky outside began to shift from deep blue to soft orange, the first threads of sunlight crawling over the city buildings like a quiet awakening. He paid the bill and drove back to the store, parked outside, and just sat in his car watching the entrance, as if seeing it for the first time, not as a workplace, but as a place where stories walked in every day wearing ordinary clothes. He remembered the first time he met Harold, years ago, when he was just starting as assistant manager, and Harold had shown him how to work the inventory scanner, with a kind patience that made Jason feel capable instead of clumsy. At the time, Jason had brushed it off, eager to climb the ladder, never realizing how much wisdom was in that simple gesture, how much kindness had been handed to him without condition. The store opened, and Jason stepped in with a slower pace, taking time to greet each employee with something more than a nod. A good morning that carried warmth instead of obligation. Harold was already in, sorting cereal boxes and humming softly to himself. And when he looked up and met Jason's eyes, there was no bitterness, only that gentle glint of timeless grace. "Early morning?" Harold asked, lifting a brow. Jason nodded, stepping beside him, helping shift a misplaced box back into line. "Couldn't sleep," he said, voice lower than usual. "Too many things on my mind. Too many things I've ignored for too long." Harold gave a small chuckle, wiping his hands on a cloth. "That's how the heart speaks when the head gets too loud," he murmured. "Eventually, it reminds you what really matters." Jason looked at the old man, saw the tired lines etched into his face, like maps of sorrow and endurance, and felt a swelling in his chest that words couldn't quite carry. "Harold, I need to say something," Jason began, his voice trembling slightly, surprising even himself. "When I fired you before, I was blind. I thought your pace was a problem, that you were just holding us back. I didn't see that you were the only one holding us together." Harold didn't respond right away, just let Jason speak without interruption, as if he knew the younger man had been waiting to say this for a long time. "You've taught me more than I learned in any leadership training, any board meeting. I just wanted you to know. I see it now. I see you now." For a moment, the silence between them was reverent, like a moment of prayer between two strangers, suddenly made family. Harold nodded slowly, eyes moist but proud, and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder with the weight of both forgiveness and understanding. "I never held it against you," he said softly. "We all carry our own clocks, ticking at different paces. I've just had more time to learn how to listen." Jason exhaled deeply, as if a burden he didn't even know he was carrying had suddenly lifted from his back. The two men stood in the aisle surrounded by boxes of cereal and canned soup, but in that moment it felt like a cathedral, quiet, sacred, full of grace and echoes of redemption. Outside, the sun rose higher, casting golden light through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny reminders of all that's unseen but present. That morning, Jason decided he would never again be the kind of leader who looked past people to chase numbers. He would lead by heart, not haste. And as Harold resumed stocking the shelves with quiet efficiency, Jason stood back and watched, not with a manager's eye, but with a son's heart, full of gratitude and humility, and the sudden, overwhelming urge to call his mother, just to say thank you. Later that afternoon, while reorganizing the manager's office, Jason stumbled upon a small, battered notebook wedged between outdated manuals and unopened mail that had gathered dust beneath the filing cabinet for what looked like years. It wasn't labeled or tagged, just a brown leather-bound book with frayed edges and a strap barely clinging to the worn cover, something that looked like it had been forgotten on purpose or left behind quietly. Curiosity nudged at him like a whisper in the dark, and with hesitant fingers, Jason flipped it open to the first page, where the name Harold N. Gray was scrawled in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. As he turned the pages, Jason discovered that it wasn't just a notebook, it was a journal filled with entries that stretched back at least 5 years, each dated and written with remarkable care and emotion. The first entry he read described Harold's first day at the store, where he talked about feeling nervous but hopeful, grateful for a second chance after retirement savings vanished in a failed investment made to support his daughter's cancer treatment. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he continued reading, discovering entry after entry where Harold documented not just daily tasks, but stories of kindness, small moments with customers, and prayers whispered quietly on lunch breaks. Some pages described conversations he had with Jason, how proud he was watching the young man grow into a leader, how he hoped Jason would one day realize that real leadership was rooted in compassion. One passage read, "He rushes, yes, but he cares. He just hasn't learned to slow down and see it yet. One day, he will." Jason's hands began to tremble as he read through a section that chronicled the weeks leading up to Harold's termination. The sorrow Harold felt, not for himself, but for the store, the people, the fabric he feared would unravel without patience at its core. "If he lets me go," Harold had written, "I will forgive him before the words even leave his mouth. He has a good heart. He just needs time to see the people behind the performance." Jason could hardly keep reading, tears burning behind his eyes as guilt and gratitude began to blur every word. In the final entry, just days after being fired, Harold wrote about a woman he'd met in the parking lot who had lost her job and came to the store just to feel normal again. "We spoke for 10 minutes, he wrote. "She said it was the first time anyone had truly listened. I think that's still work, even if it's not paid." Jason closed the notebook, pressing it to his chest, like it held something sacred, like a key to a door in his soul he hadn't known existed until it was unlocked. His heart ached, not just for what he'd done, but for what he'd missed. How many people had walked through his store needing more than groceries, and how Harold had seen them all while Jason was too busy chasing metrics. That evening, Jason walked to Harold's locker, still intact from when he'd cleared it out, but hadn't been reassigned yet, and placed the notebook gently inside with a small sticky note. "I read every page. Thank you for seeing what I didn't." Then, with a deep breath, Jason walked the aisles, not as a manager checking inventory, but as a man searching for moments he might have overlooked, listening to the murmurs of life, echoing through fluorescent lights and scuffed tile. He approached Daniela at the register, a single mum who always wore a tired smile, and offered to cover her shift next Friday so she could attend her daughter's play something she'd mentioned months ago that he had completely forgotten. He stopped by the break room and sat with Marcus, the stock boy who barely spoke a word, but always stayed late without being asked, and simply listened as Marcus talked about his love for drawing and his dream of becoming a graphic novelist. For the first time, Jason understood that managing a store was less about managing things and more about managing the hearts of the people who made the store breathe, laugh, and exist beyond numbers. He thought of Harold's quiet dignity, how even after being wronged, he never once raised his voice, never once withheld kindness. Later that night, Jason stood by the large window at the front of the store, looking out at the parking lot as streetlights blinked to life, one by one, like the store itself was exhaling slowly after a long day. A customer walked by with a child clinging to her hand, and Jason smiled, remembering how Harold always kept small toys behind the counter for restless kids. He realized now that those toys weren't just toys. They were empathy in plastic form, quiet gestures that made the store feel like home for those passing through. In his own reflection on the glass, Jason saw someone different, less polished, more human, a man shaped by humility and lit by the soft glow of understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the store's master calendar, crossing out the usual monthly staff review and replacing it with something new. Story Hour with Harold. Everyone, welcome. He didn't know exactly what it would become, but he knew this much. If the old man had something to share, Jason would make sure the whole world heard it. Because sometimes the slowest steps lead you to the most important destinations, and the people who move the quietest carry the heaviest stories worth hearing. The day of the first Story Hour arrived with an uncertain hum, the store buzzing with the usual noises of scanners beeping and carts rolling. But something new hovered in the air like the scent of fresh coffee brewing in a quiet cafe. Jason had cleared a small corner near the break room, arranging chairs in a loose semicircle around a warm, comfortable armchair Harold had brought from home, a throne for stories waiting to be told. Flyers had been quietly slipped under employee doors, and a few curious regular customers lingered near the setup, their faces a mix of curiosity and warmth. Jason watched from a distance, feeling the same nervous anticipation he'd felt before important meetings. But this time, it wasn't about sales or numbers. It was about connection and healing, about opening a space where time slowed down and hearts could speak. Harold arrived just before the hour, carrying a small box filled with notebooks, photographs, and old trinkets he had collected over the years, each with its own story folded inside. He smiled gently, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of gratitude and a quiet pride that Jason had never seen before, as if this moment had been waiting for decades to arrive. The staff gathered hesitantly at first, unsure what to expect, but the moment Harold cleared his throat and began speaking, the room seemed to exhale in relief, the walls absorbing the soft cadence of his voice. Like a balm, he told stories about the people he'd met in the store, the little acts of kindness that had saved days, even lives, and the sacrifices made quietly by families and strangers alike. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of a community often overlooked, and his words wove them into a fabric of empathy and resilience. Jason watched as the young cashier Daniela wiped tears from her eyes when Harold spoke of a mother who had held her children close during a power outage, reminding everyone that love was stronger than fear. Marcus, the quiet stock boy, leaned forward, entranced by a tale about a struggling artist who found inspiration in the aisles between canned goods and cereal boxes. Customers who had drifted in from the parking lot sat still and attentive, the harsh fluorescent light softened by the warmth of shared humanity filling the room. Jason felt his own walls crumbling, the manager's armor dissolving into something more fragile but infinitely stronger: humility. He realized that the store had always been a place of stories, and that Harold was the keeper of those stories, slow but steady, patient and unyielding. When Harold finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment, before applause blossomed gently like wildflowers, tentative but heartfelt, and Jason stepped forward to thank him, voice thick with emotion. He invited everyone to share their own stories next week, to bring their struggles, their hopes, and the small moments that made life bearable and beautiful. The energy shifted, as if a seed had been planted in the middle of a barren field, promising new growth where before there had only been routine and rush. Jason could see the change not just in the staff, but in himself. The desire to lead with patience, to listen before judging, to honor the slow rhythms that held their community together. For the first time in a long time, the store felt like a home, a sanctuary, a place where every person mattered beyond their productivity. After the event, Harold pulled Jason aside, his voice gentle but firm, reminding him that stories weren't just entertainment. They were the lifeblood of understanding, the threads that tied people together in unseen ways. He told Jason that patience was more than waiting. It was the art of watching, listening, and believing in the unseen battles each person fought every day. Jason nodded, feeling the weight of Harold's wisdom settle deep in his bones, a lesson learned not from a manual but from a man who had lived it quietly and faithfully. As the store closed that night, Jason stayed behind to tidy up, pausing in the now empty corner where the chairs had been, sensing that something precious had begun here, a new chapter not just for the store but for himself. He realized that he had been rushing through life like a fast-forwarded movie, missing the beauty of the small, still moments where real change takes root. And in that silence, he promised himself he would never again be the kind of leader who sacrificed people on the altar of speed and efficiency. Harold's slow, steady footsteps had carried a truth. Jason needed more than anything that patience, sacrifice and gratitude were not weaknesses, but the strongest kind of power. And as Jason switched off the lights and locked the doors, he felt a quiet peace settle over him, the kind that comes from finally seeing the stories behind the faces and the people behind the pace. That night, long after the store had gone dark and the streets outside had emptied into silence, Jason sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets he couldn't focus on, and reports that now felt cold and meaningless. The echo of Harold's voice still lingered in his ears, not just the words, but the pauses between them, where years of pain and quiet endurance whispered truths Jason had never taken the time to hear. He stared at the screen in front of him, a performance dashboard glowing blue in the dim light, but his mind kept returning to Harold's trembling hands, lifting a tiny photo of his late wife from that story box, eyes filled with loss and unshakable love. That image had pierced something in Jason, a guarded part of him he didn't even realize was still sore. His own father, who had died years ago, quiet and kind, uncelebrated, but always present. Jason had barely mourned him properly, too busy climbing ladders and chasing targets, too afraid to slow down long enough to feel the grief that waited behind every silence. He pushed his laptop aside and stood by the window, watching the night breeze stir the leaves of the tree just outside, its branches trembling in the wind, like an old man's fingers reaching for something just out of sight. The city glowed faintly beneath a shroud of fatigue, headlights trailing like ghosts across the asphalt, lives rushing past one another without ever touching. Jason thought about all the employees whose stories he'd never asked for, whose burdens he'd dismissed in the name of policy, whose quiet suffering had unfolded right under his nose. He remembered Rosa, the single mother who worked double shifts but smiled through it, and Tom, the former soldier who still flinched when crates slammed too loud, and he felt ashamed of how little he truly knew about the people who built his success. His breath hitched unexpectedly, and before he could stop himself, the tears came, hot and unrelenting, spilling from somewhere deep, where regret and guilt had settled like sediment on the ocean floor. He sank to the floor, the tile cool against his skin, as if the earth itself was trying to calm him, to let him know it was okay to fall apart for once. All this time, he had thought strength was measured in control, in numbers hit and tasks completed. But Harold had shown him that true strength was gentler, softer, and harder to notice. The kind of strength it took to keep showing up despite grief, to speak kindly when the world was unkind. Jason remembered the way Harold had adjusted his tie before story hour, smoothing it with shaky hands as if preparing for something sacred. And he realized that for Harold, the stories were not a pastime, they were a legacy. He whispered a quiet apology into the stillness, not just to Harold, but to his father, to every employee he had overlooked, every moment of humanity he had sacrificed in the name of progress. The sobs slowed eventually, tapering into silence, but the ache remained, a necessary weight that grounded him in a deeper awareness. He sat there in the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, and he made a promise to never again choose speed over souls, to lead not just with his mind, but with his heart. His phone buzzed beside him. A simple message from Harold. "Thank you for seeing me." Jason stared at the words for a long time, feeling something shift again, something almost like healing. He typed a reply through blurry eyes. "Thank you for teaching me how." He didn't sleep much that night, but it didn't matter. Some nights weren't for resting. They were for waking up to the truth of who you've been and who you need to become. As the first hints of dawn filtered through the blinds, Jason stood once more and looked around his apartment, now feeling less like a haven and more like a cocoon about to split open. He knew things at the store had to change, not just for Harold, but for everyone, for the quiet stories waiting to be heard and the hearts too tired to speak unless invited. And with that realization, a strange peace settled over him, not because everything was fixed, but because he finally understood what needed to be done. The Monday morning meeting began like any other, with employees trickling in slowly, their expressions marked by routine fatigue and guarded skepticism. Unsure of what new policies or corrections awaited them, Jason stood at the front of the small staff room, coffee in hand, heart pounding with the weight of what he needed to say. Not a speech, not a directive, but an acknowledgement, raw and real. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows on his face as he glanced at Harold, seated quietly in the back, notebook in his lap, his presence grounding and calm. The room quieted as Jason cleared his throat, and instead of launching into updates, he took a long breath and began with an apology. He spoke not as a manager, but as a man who had been blind to the invisible battles his team carried every day, who had once measured value by speed instead of soul. The room remained still as his words drifted out, slow, deliberate, and thick with emotion, as he admitted to firing Harold too quickly, to misunderstanding what slow really meant. He told them how he had learned, not from a leadership manual or a corporate seminar, but from Harold's stories and silence, from the quiet grace of someone who had survived more than he ever would. Some staff shifted in their seats, eyebrows raised, surprised to hear humility from the man who once ruled the floor with unbending precision. Jason didn't hide from their glances or discomfort. He leaned into it, confessing how he had mistaken efficiency for effectiveness, and how that mindset had cost him connection, trust, and something close to purpose. He said he was done with being just a manager and was ready to learn how to be a leader, one who saw people not as tools but as stories in motion. He asked them to speak, to share their frustrations, their ideas, their truths, not in a suggestion box, but right here, with him, face to face, heart to heart. At first, there was only silence, the kind that stretches long and tense, waiting to see if this vulnerability was real, or another ploy wrapped in good intentions. Then Daniela spoke, her voice quiet but firm, about the day she'd cried in the freezer after losing her apartment, and still finished her shift because she was too afraid to ask for help. Marcus shared next, revealing his PTSD and how the store's loud crashes sometimes transported him to a battlefield no one else could see. One by one, the employees began to open, their voices like water breaking through a dam, their pain raw but honest, their resilience glowing brighter with every confession. Jason listened, fully and without defense, taking notes not for a report, but for a promise. When Harold finally spoke, he didn't tell a story but simply said, "We don't need perfect leaders, just ones who remember we're human." The room was silent again, but this time not out of fear or doubt. It was the quiet that follows truth. The breath held after a wound is finally named. Jason nodded, overcome by a quiet reverence, and told them that every policy would be re-examined, not to make things easier, but to make things kinder. He announced a new open-door time, mental health resources, flexible scheduling, and even time set aside each week for community building, including story hour and peer appreciation sessions. The changes were small, but they were rooted in something powerful, not efficiency, but empathy, not metrics, but meaning. As the meeting drew to a close, no one rushed out the door, as they usually did. Instead, people lingered, talked, laughed, even a new spirit rising from the ashes of silence. Jason stayed behind, speaking with each team member, learning their names not just as entries on a payroll, but as people whose stories he now had the honor of hearing. Harold walked over and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, saying nothing, but offering the kind of affirmation that needed no words. Jason felt it all then, the guilt, the gratitude, the growth settle inside him, not as a burden, but as a new foundation. The meeting hadn't just changed the store's direction, it had reset its soul. That evening, as the staff filed back into their routines, there was something different in the air. Not less work, not slower lines, but more purpose, more connection, more room for people to breathe. Jason stood quietly by the front entrance, watching his team move with renewed energy, and realized that patience wasn't about slowing down. It was about seeing clearly, and for the first time in a long time, he saw not just employees but a family, broken in places but healing together. The next Saturday, the store felt different, not quieter or louder, but warmer, as if the walls themselves had softened, to listen, to welcome, to breathe again. Jason arrived early, walking slowly past the registers and down the aisles, letting his fingers trail the shelves, as if reacquainting himself with a place that had once only been lines and ledgers. In the small event space nestled between the children's section and the seasonal aisle, Harold stood adjusting a fold-out chair, his hands still trembling, but more confidently than before, a quiet pride in his eyes. There was a new sign this time, Saturday Story Hour, real stories from real hearts. And beneath it, in smaller print, hosted by Mr. Harold, beloved friend and storyteller. Jason read it twice, emotion tightening his throat as children and parents began trickling in, unaware of how sacred this small corner was about to become. Harold had prepared something different that day. Not just a fable, not just a fairy tale, but a true story about a young boy who used to stutter so badly that he refused to speak in class, and how a kind librarian once handed him a book and told him, "Read it aloud, and the story will carry your voice." The children sat cross-legged on rugs, wide-eyed and listening, not just to the story, but to the heartbeat behind it. The courage wrapped in every syllable Harold offered. Parents stood behind them, some smiling, some with tears in their eyes, as the room melted into one shared breath. One long listen, one human connection that ignored age, background, or pain. Jason watched from the side, arms crossed over his chest, not in judgment, but in quiet awe, feeling his heart break and rebuild itself with every word Harold spoke. When the story ended, the children clapped loudly, and a few ran forward to hug Harold, who knelt slowly and held them gently, as if they were reminders that hope still bloomed even in aching hands. Jason stepped forward then, holding a small flat box tied with blue ribbon, and offered it to Harold, who looked surprised but accepted it carefully. Inside was a gold-plated name tag, engraved with the words Harold Monroe, Legacy Team Member and Storykeeper, and beside it a handwritten note that read, "You remind us of what matters most." For a moment, Harold said nothing, his eyes shining too brightly to speak, and instead he placed the name tag gently over his heart, holding it there with both hands. The room broke into applause once more, not out of ceremony, but out of something deeper, respect earned through presence, not position. Jason turned to the crowd and, with a slight tremor in his voice, shared what he had learned, not from books or training, but from the man beside him who had once been labeled too slow. He spoke about sacrifice, about unseen burdens, about how easy it is to make quick judgments, and how costly it is to carry them unchallenged. He confessed his mistakes, not for pity, but to make space for growth, for humility, for second chances not just in business, but in life. One parent stepped forward and said, "We come here every Saturday now, not just for the stories, but for the spirit," and others nodded, their approval soft and sincere. Jason looked at Harold, who simply smiled and whispered, "I told you, everyone has a story. We just have to listen." As the crowd dispersed, and the space returned to stillness, Jason helped Harold fold the chairs, neither speaking much, the silence between them now comfortable, like pages being gently turned. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled through the glass doors, casting golden rays across the tile floor, and Jason paused there, realizing this wasn't just a store anymore. It was becoming a place of healing. He knew there was still much to do, old habits to unlearn, systems to mend, but today they had taken a step not toward profit, but toward purpose. And for Jason, that shift made all the difference. That night, Jason sat by his window again, watching as the city lived on, but this time he wasn't detached from it. He felt part of it, part of something bigger, something real. He thought of Harold's story, the librarian, the boy who found his voice, and realized that maybe, just maybe, they had all found theirs too. After the families left, the store settled into a rare, peaceful hush, the kind that only follows something sacred, like a secret being shared and gently received, without resistance or noise. Jason and Harold sat for a while in the now empty story area, a thermos of coffee between them, sipping slowly as the warm scent of cinnamon rolls from the bakery section, floated in the air like comfort. The silence stretched wide but kind, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled, only honored, like a soft blanket wrapped around tired shoulders. Jason finally spoke, asking Harold what kept him coming back, even after being fired, even after being dismissed so carelessly, with no questions asked and no time given. Harold smiled faintly, looked at his hands, then said, "Because sometimes when you lose everything, all you have left is your reason." He went on to explain how the store wasn't just a job, but a space where he remembered who he used to be before the world got heavy. A place where he could still matter without needing to be fast. Jason listened, the words piercing slowly through the walls he'd once built, and felt something inside him bend, then break, then bloom. Later that afternoon, as regular customers came and went, a few noticed the new sign next to the registers, Employee Spotlight, featuring Harold's photograph, beside a short handwritten bio about his love for stories, children, and coffee with too much sugar. It became an unspoken thing among the staff to direct new hires to Harold first, not just for orientation, but to learn what compassion looked like in human form. Some even took to calling him Grandpa Harold, and though he laughed at it, there was something in his eyes that said the name meant more than they could know. Jason observed all of this from a distance, not as a manager tracking behavior, but as someone quietly relearning the rhythms of dignity and patience. He started spending his break times with Harold, who shared more than stories. He shared perspective, the kind that can't be taught, but only lived through. One afternoon, Harold looked at him and said, "You remind me of my son sometimes," and the weight of that simple line hung heavy between them. Jason didn't press for more, just nodded with a lump in his throat, and felt honored to be compared to someone Harold had once loved. The community around the store began to notice a difference. Parents lingered longer, employees smiled more sincerely, and something in the air shifted from routine to refuge. Saturday story hours turned into full-circle events, where not just children but their parents, neighbors, and even teens came to listen, bringing blankets, snacks, and questions for Harold. He began weaving real-life lessons into the tales, often starting with a simple, "Once upon a time there was a man who thought he was too broken to matter," and each time the room grew still. Jason offered Harold a microphone once, but Harold politely declined, saying, "Some stories don't need to be loud to be heard. They just need to be true." The store's social media page started featuring snippets of these sessions, and followers poured in, leaving comments like, "I cried. Thank you for this. And this reminds me of my dad." The corporate office, curious about the sudden spike in community engagement, asked Jason what was going on, and he simply replied, "We started listening." Jason began inviting other staff members to take part in the Saturday sessions, encouraging them to share their own stories, struggles, and little moments that made them who they were. One cashier, Marta, spoke about immigrating alone at 17, while another, Isaiah, shared how he overcame a speech disorder to become the store's most outgoing greeter. As they each spoke, Harold would nod from the side like a proud mentor, occasionally chiming in with supportive jokes or a gentle guiding hand. Jason watched these moments unfold with a sense of awe. He had expected increased morale, but what he saw was healing, an invisible stitching of community that transformed the store into more than just a retail space. People didn't just shop here anymore. They came to feel seen, heard, and held in ways most places no longer offered. And in the midst of all this, Harold's steps grew a little steadier, his smile a little broader, as if the very act of sharing his pain had made room for joy. Jason felt it too, a strange lightness in his chest that he hadn't known he'd been missing. That evening, long after the doors had closed and the last customer had left, Jason stayed behind to help Harold clean up the event space. They stacked chairs, rolled up rugs, and wiped down tables under the soft glow of the overhead lights, moving quietly but comfortably. As they reached the final chair, Harold paused, set it down, and turned to Jason with a look that held years behind it. "I never got to teach my son how to tie a tie," he said, voice catching slightly, "but I've taught a dozen kids how to hold a story, and somehow that feels enough now." Jason felt his breath hitch, unsure what to say, and instead simply stepped forward and hugged him tightly. No words needed. In that embrace, something old passed away, and something new was born, something stronger than forgiveness, more enduring than regret. They stood there a moment longer, two men of different worlds, now bound by one simple truth: compassion changes everything. The next morning began like any other, with the sun barely touching the sky, and Jason unlocking the front doors of the store, still rubbing sleep from his eyes as the soft chime of the entrance echoed through the empty aisles. The overnight crew had done their part, and the store looked spotless, with freshly stocked shelves and polished floors gleaming under the fluorescence, as if they knew something special was about to happen. Jason moved toward his office, coffee in hand, and thoughts drifting lazily between emails, orders, and Harold's next story hour, but paused when he noticed a folded envelope sitting alone in the center of his desk. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Harold's, delicate, looping, and slow, the kind of writing that came from years of practice and patience, not speed. Jason's stomach tightened as he slowly set his cup down, slid his finger under the flap, and pulled out a thick, carefully folded letter, its paper already soft from having been held and reread many times. He took a deep breath and sat down, bracing himself for what felt like a goodbye, the silence around him suddenly louder than ever before. As he unfolded the letter, Harold's voice echoed in his mind, warm and measured, and for the first time, Jason realized how much space that voice had taken up in his world. "Dear Jason," it began, in handwriting so heartfelt it seemed to breathe between the lines. "I've seen seasons turn quicker than most people blink, and I felt the weight of time press down until it nearly erased me." The words unfolded like a confession and a blessing, stitched with memory and longing, each sentence revealing layers of Harold's journey that even the stories hadn't told. He wrote of his late wife, Margaret, whose photo he still carried in his wallet and spoke to at night, and of his son Daniel, who died in a car accident just weeks before his college graduation, a pain Harold never fully recovered from. The job at the store, he said, was never about the money or the hours. It was about staying connected to life, to people, to something that kept his heart moving forward. On days it would rather stop. He thanked Jason, not for rehiring him, but for letting him matter again, for seeing him beyond the wrinkles and the slowness and the forgotten edges of his story. By the time Jason reached the final paragraph, tears had begun falling silently, one by one, splashing against the paper like punctuation marks from a heart that had finally broken open. The letter ended with an invitation, not a farewell, telling Jason that Harold would be taking a week off to travel to a small cabin up north, where he and Margaret had spent their honeymoon 50 years ago. It wasn't goodbye, Harold insisted, but a return, a promise to come back to the stories, to the children, and to the store that had become more home than most places ever managed to be. Jason sat there long after he'd finished reading, the letter held gently in his hands like something sacred, unwilling to fold it back up just yet. He stared out the office window at the quiet store floor, feeling the weight of everything Harold had shared, and the new depth of gratitude swelling in his chest, like a tide he couldn't hold back. That morning, instead of diving into inventory spreadsheets or vendor calls, he took the time to draft a letter of his own, not to Harold but to corporate, detailing the true heart of their store and the man who made it beat stronger. He ended the letter with a single line: "We don't just need Harold, we need more like him." By mid-afternoon, a package arrived for Harold at the store, sent by Jason himself, containing a custom leather journal with the inscription, "For the stories only you can tell." Jason placed it in Harold's locker with a sticky note that read, "Can't wait to hear the next chapter," and smiled at the thought of the old man discovering it. Later, as customers bustled through the doors and the noise of daily life returned, Jason moved through the aisles differently, slower, more intentionally, pausing to greet regulars, help elderly shoppers reach shelves, and listen to quick life updates from employees. Something in him had shifted, a reorientation of heart and mind that couldn't be undone, and he welcomed it with open arms. Every now and then he caught himself looking toward the front of the store, half expecting Harold to appear in his cardigan, smiling and holding a clipboard, ready to share a story, or a memory, or a piece of gentle wisdom. And each time, Jason felt the presence of Harold's influence, like a quiet promise echoing through the air. Patience makes room for grace, and grace changes everything. That night, before leaving the store, Jason placed Harold's letter in a frame and hung it near the employee entrance, just beside the time clock, where every staff member would see it before and after each shift. He titled it, "Why We Show Up," and over time it became more than just a letter. It became a landmark, a quiet altar to kindness, resilience, and the power of knowing someone's story before making a judgment. Staff began touching the frame gently as they clocked in, a small ritual of gratitude, a moment to remember what truly mattered in the rush of retail. New employees were brought to it during orientation, and the story of Harold's letter became a tale in itself, one that inspired not just better workers, but better people. And though Harold was away that week, his spirit seemed to linger in the laughter, in the pauses, in the way people began looking at one another just a little longer, just a little kinder. Jason stood before the frame one last time before heading home, whispering softly, "Thank you, Harold," as the lights dimmed behind him and the store gently exhaled into night. Because now he knew that sometimes the slowest people carry the heaviest stories, and that makes them the strongest of all. The northern highway curved like a ribbon through forests, gilded in late autumn gold. As Jason drove up alone with the windows cracked, just enough to let in the crisp scent of pine and earth. He hadn't planned to visit Harold, but after rereading the letter for the 10th time, and feeling its warmth echo in the quiet of his empty apartment, he knew he needed to go. The drive gave him time to think, not in the rushed, agenda-laced way he was used to, but in the patient, meandering way Harold might have approved of, with each mile peeling back layers of noise from his mind. Jason thought about his own father, who he hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years over a disagreement that now seemed embarrassingly small in the grand sweep of time and grief. He thought about how many people passed through his life without ever revealing the depths of who they were, and how quick he had been to judge Harold on nothing more than pace and posture. As the trees thinned and a narrow dirt road appeared just ahead, Jason turned slowly, heart pounding a little from nerves, unsure if this visit would feel like intrusion or healing. The cabin stood quietly at the end of the path, tucked between 2 ancient pines like a secret memory holding its breath, smoke curling from the chimney, and a rocking chair swaying gently on the porch. He parked and stepped out slowly, each footfall softened by fallen leaves, and raised a hand to knock, but paused when the door creaked open, and Harold stepped out with a smile. "Figured you might show up." Harold said gently, voice full of that familiar, unhurried rhythm that always made everything seem simpler. Jason laughed despite himself, heart loosening at the edges, and walked forward into the embrace that Harold offered, without hesitation or explanation. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedarwood and old books, and Jason could almost feel Margaret's presence in the way the curtains danced slightly with the breeze, and the shelves overflowed with novels and framed photos. They sat by the fire for hours, sipping tea and speaking with the kind of ease that only came when nothing needed proving, just sharing. Harold told stories he hadn't even included in the letter, about Margaret's laugh echoing over the lake, about Daniel's dreams of becoming a teacher, and about the years in between where Harold had wandered so far from himself he wasn't sure he'd return. Jason listened, nodding, not speaking unless prompted, humbled by the honesty and haunted by the realization that he had nearly silenced this voice forever. When the fire burned low and the stars stretched endless over the trees, Harold looked over and said something that would never leave Jason. People break at different speeds, son. It's not about how fast you fix them, but how long you're willing to sit beside the pieces. Jason slept in a small guest room that night, the walls lined with photos and quilts stitched by Margaret's hands, and he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He dreamed of aisles filled not with products, but with people holding stories like lanterns, moving carefully through the dark so they wouldn't shatter. The next morning, they shared a quiet breakfast of eggs and toast, and as Jason helped wash dishes, he asked Harold if he would ever consider writing his full story in that journal. Harold smiled and tapped his chest, saying, "Already started, just needed someone to remind me why it matters." They walked the lake trail together before Jason left, boots crunching over frost-dusted leaves, with silence hanging easy between them like an old friend. At the car, Harold handed Jason a folded page torn from the journal, a simple paragraph about their visit, already inked in Harold's tender script, with the final line reading, "Sometimes grace arrives in the form of someone who finally sees you." Driving back, Jason felt something shift again, not just in how he managed the store, but how he moved through life, with a new slowness that wasn't laziness but reverence. He stopped halfway through the drive to call his father, leaving a voicemail full of apology and hope, and cried alone in the parking lot when he was done. Back at the store the next day, he gathered the staff and shared a story, not Harold's but his own, about mistakes and growth, and how sometimes the best leaders are the ones who learn late, but learn deep. He introduced a new initiative where every employee got time during shifts to share something personal, whether a story, a photo, or just a memory, so no one would ever feel as unseen as Harold had once felt. Over time, it changed the culture, turned co-workers into companions, and transformed the store into more than a place of transactions. It became a place of presence. When Harold returned, he found his locker filled not just with notes and gifts from employees, but with a printed schedule of story hours hosted by staff members every week. Inspired by him, he blinked fast as he read the names and themes: Maria's journey from Cuba, Jeff's battle with anxiety, Ellie's quiet comeback, each one a chapter of a new collective book being written in real time. And as he stepped into the break room, he saw Jason waiting with a hand on his heart and eyes full of the kind of welcome that needed no words. They didn't speak much that day, but they didn't have to, because in some bonds, the silence says enough. From that day forward, Harold didn't just work at the store, he anchored it, and every slow step he took reminded everyone to walk softer, look deeper, and listen longer. It was a quiet Saturday morning when Harold posted the flyer on the break room bulletin board, using 4 neat pins to keep it straight. Special story hour, one last tale, 5 p.m. today. The announcement sent a ripple through the staff like the first hush before a snowfall, soft and curious, full of expectation. No one knew what he would share, only that it mattered enough to make it the last one. Jason saw it while grabbing his lunch, the simple handwriting stopping him mid-step, and something in his chest tightened with the quiet certainty that today was the end of a chapter they'd never want to finish. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, nearly every employee, off-duty or not, had returned, gathering in the small children's corner between aisle 6 and the back wall, where Harold had always read. Customers lingered nearby, sensing something rare was unfolding, their carts momentarily forgotten, as they turned toward the hush that fell like a benediction. Harold stood in front of them, not with a book, but with the leather journal Jason had gifted him, the pages worn, corners soft, and his fingers trembling just slightly as he opened to a marked passage. He looked around the room, at the familiar faces that now felt like family, and smiled in that way only Harold could, gentle, tired, but filled with light. "This isn't a fairy tale," he began, voice soft but steady, "but it's the story I've waited a lifetime to tell." He spoke of regrets, the quiet kind that don't shout, but whisper for decades, of working too much after Daniel died, of missing chances to grieve out loud, of carrying Margaret's voice in his heart, but never recording it. But he also spoke of redemption, found not in grand gestures, but in daily grace, the kind Jason gave him, the kind the store had shown him, the kind he finally gave himself. Every word felt like a thread, weaving them all together into something sacred, a fabric of shared silence, tears, and held breath. And when he closed the journal, no one clapped. They just sat with it, as if applause would shatter what had just been mended. Afterward, Jason walked Harold to the door, neither saying much, because both knew goodbyes spoken too loudly could unravel all the quiet magic. As Harold stepped into the golden hour light, Jason reached into his pocket and handed him a key, small, brass, and warm. "To the store," Jason said, "for whenever you feel like coming home." Harold looked at it, eyes damp, and nodded. "Don't worry," he said. "Stories never really end. They just wait for someone new to keep reading." And with that, he walked away, back into the world with the soft shuffle of someone who had already left behind a legacy too deep for shelves or inventory. The following week, a plaque appeared above the children's reading corner, simple, wooden and hand-carved. It read, "Harold's Corner, for those who listen with their hearts." Parents began bringing their kids to the store, just for story hour, even when Harold wasn't there, because the space carried something more than memory. It carried intention. Employees took turns reading books and telling stories, not because they had to, but because it felt like the only way to honor what had begun there. Jason often stood near the end of the aisle during those readings, hands in his pockets, smile tucked quietly under the surface, remembering the first time he'd doubted Harold, and the last time he ever would. Months passed, then a year, and though Harold visited less, each appearance felt like a holiday, a sacred arrival marked by hugs, laughter, and new pages added to the leather journal, now kept behind the service desk, open to all who wanted to read. Jason eventually became regional manager, but kept his office at the same store, because some things mattered more than title or upward steps. And every time a new employee joined, he'd walk them past Harold's framed letter, past the plaque, and finally to the children's corner, where he'd pause and say, "This is where the heart of the store beats." Most would nod politely, not quite understanding, at least not yet. One rainy evening years later, long after Harold had passed peacefully in his sleep, Jason found himself alone in the store, shelves quiet, floors shining, and a single copy of Goodnight Moon resting forgotten on a stool in the reading corner. He picked it up, turned to the first page, and began to read aloud, not for customers, not for staff, but because something inside him still needed to say goodbye. The words echoed softly through the aisles, familiar and warm, like an old friend's hand on your shoulder. And when he finished, he closed the book gently, stood slowly, and whispered into the silence, "We remember you," and the store, holding its breath like it always had, whispered back. And that brings us to the end of He Fired the Old Man, a story of patience, redemption, and the quiet power of human connection. If this tale stirred something in you, imagine what else is waiting in the corners of history and everyday life. We dive deep into stories like these, real or inspired, historical or hauntingly human. So if you enjoy meaningful narratives that leave a lasting echo, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our upcoming deep dives into the untold stories that shaped our world. Until then, keep listening, keep wondering.